Firewatch is a very special game for me. I played it when it released in 2016, and I think it was the first ever time I played a game that I knew had the tag walking simulator. Please let's stop calling games that. I mean, it's awful. It just doesn't do them any justice. Firewatch is an incredibly well-crafted story, a narrative-driven adventure which introduces themes like mental health, loneliness, love, dependency, and people's responses to adverse situations. It is a masterpiece of relatability and sculpting empathy, and while it looks like a game that you explore a world in, the main exploration comes from understanding the motivations and mindset of the character you play as. It's a character analysis of broken people in a difficult, unforgiving world. Firewatch is one of those games that I wish that I could forget and then play again with no idea of what was happening. It's why till now that honestly I never thought I'd play it again, because wrongly I thought once you know the story, what else is there to see? But those of you who know my channel know that I love talking about and sharing the best indie experiences, and one that ranks highly on my list is Firewatch. I would argue that it is one of the best told stories that I have ever experienced in a game. At times it's funny, it's compelling, and then it's filled with suspense, and in moments, it's brutal. It's not the kind of game that comes with multiple endings, but instead it's such a carefully crafted story that the writers wanted you to experience the way that they wrote it. A tight story that forces such a deep level of empathy with the main character you play as. Henry, a normal man, a man with a difficult life, someone who runs from adverse situations, a man with issues, someone we would never want to be in, a situation we would never want to find ourselves in. And the whole experience gets beautifully wrapped up in a bleak and dark ending. And while I know that ending caused a lot of division amongst the players who played it, I honestly thought it was perfect. And it hit me like a train wreck. So with all my knowledge of the game, I thought I'd seen everything there was to see, but playing it 6 years later, I saw something different that I hadn't noticed the first time round. Like I said, I knew Firewatch mastered the creation of empathy, but the second time round, it became more apparent how they'd taken me on such an emotional journey. The action of the main game in the national park where we take control somewhat mirrors the backstory of Henry presented in the prologue. It's almost like the two run in tandem. It allows us to connect and reach a similar emotional state as our character in the end, to feel somewhat akin to what he felt. And when we reach that finale, it caused the ending to impact deeply, an ending which was designed to sting. Now, needless to say that the rest of this video will be rammed with spoilers, so if you haven't played it and you want to, I suggest you turn off this video right now and come back when you've finished it. It's only a few hours long, so I'll see you in a few hours. And if you came here looking for a review from 6 years later, then I'll just say this. If you like those strong narrative-driven adventures discussing some of the themes like the ones I mentioned, all delivered in stunning graphics with an amazing soundtrack and beautifully and believably delivered voice acting, then check this out. I quite obviously loved it. But now I'm going to talk in more depth about the themes of the game. So, spoilers in 3, 2, 1. The game starts out like this, a prologue, text-based, like a mixture between a psychological test and a choose-your-own-adventure novel. The text-based section is designed to give you the backstory to the main game. This part is the story of Henry, the protagonist, meeting Julia, and we as the gamers are merely observers. The genius of this section is that it gives you enough freedom of choice to give you the illusion that you're in control of the story, but at the same time, while the story is sad, we don't fully invest in the story at this point, which I know sounds negative, but it's not, because the game and the writers don't want you to feel too much too soon. The story starts out in a bar. Drunk, Henry meets the love of his life, Julia. She's smart and she's funny, and before long the two are in a relationship. They're happy, they're free, they go to dinner parties and they drink, they talk about kids, but they put it off till later as life is to be lived. They get a dog, it's an exciting time, the initial thrill of a new relationship followed by the security of marital bliss. Then Julia gets offered a job far away in another state, and through my choices they ended up dating at a distance. But then something starts to happen. Julia starts to forget things and confusion ensues. I mean, what's happening? Before long, Julia's diagnosed with early onset dementia, which leads to Alzheimer's. And this is where Henry's life starts to fall apart. Now, through my choices, gone with the frivolity of parties with friends, and instead it's drinking alone. Isolation and loneliness creep into Henry's life. In fact, in this section, I noticed that alcohol plays an interesting part. It starts off by giving Henry the courage to speak to Julia, and then it becomes a social outlet, and before long it becomes a comfort and support. Now, while alcohol does hold a significant place in the whole game, I don't think it's a main focus, nor is Henry an alcoholic. What it does seem to suggest is that for Henry, he uses alcohol as a crutch, and I think he has a dependency on that, not booze, but crutches. For a while, Julia seemed to take that supporting role. He seems dependent on her, and when she's gone, when the dementia creeps in, his support, his crutch, is gone. Dementia is a cruel and horrific condition. Unlike many other illnesses that ravage the body, you can't see the physical effects. Unlike diseases like cancer, which you can rally with friends and family to fight, there's no fight against Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease is a degradation of the self, our core being effectively leaving our bodies. While the person looks the same, inside they're gradually fading away. And from my own experience, it's heartbreaking to see that person slip away to the point where they no longer know who you are. It's sad, it's bleak, and it becomes lonely. But this is not Julia's story, it's Henry's. And it is in this adversity we learn what type of man Henry is. He's a man that when push comes to shove will try to escape his problems. Now, this section of the game is undeniably sad, it's heavy, and we know that. And I think we as gamers have sympathy, not empathy. We feel sorry for them, but we don't totally understand what Henry's going through, not yet. And if we're totally honest, I don't think we want to. We don't want to deal with that, it's a lot, especially from a character that we've barely just met, and I think that's why the developers chose to present this section in this way, text-based. It affords an element of detachment, which is interesting because I think it's important to fostering empathy later on. And that sounds a bit contradictory, but I'm getting there. So when Henry decides to run away from the situation, it's almost like a relief for us as the player as well. We can also escape his problems, and in that statement I just made, it's clear that with Henry and us both on the same page at the end of the prologue, not wanting to deal with his problems, the true bond of empathy begins. We arrive in the forest, and the first thing we need to do is get accustomed to the environment and the controls. We're a little bit lost, but obviously it's exciting, a new game. Suddenly a voice comes over the radio. It's Delilah, Henry's supervisor. She's funny, she's confident, charming, and charismatic. She settles us into the game, and in the initial stages, she tells us the ropes over the radio. In a gameplay sense, she's the tutorial, but what this section also does is mirror the start of that prologue. We, like Henry drunk in the bar, are a little bit lost and out of our depth, and a female character is the one to ease us in. What is really amazing is how quickly we as the player become interested in and attached to talking with Delilah. And yes, that's in part down to the phenomenal voice acting of the two characters, but I think it's also due to the fact that when the radio goes silent, the game has this kind of eerie calm. You only really notice the second time around how isolating and lonely this game truly is. You never really hear any other voice other than Delilah's except for a few brief moments. There isn't an abundance of animals in the forest, there's no other people who you really see clearly, only at a distance. You never see a face other than in photos. The fireman at the end wears a mask, and the body we discover's face has been crushed by a rock. And there's also very little noise other than that atmospheric soundtrack, nothing to distract us from the isolation. And in a way, we as gamers become dependent on hearing the two characters chatter to break the silence. Now, like I said, the initial stage of this game is exciting. Everything is new and vibrant in a stunning new world, a wealth of possibilities, much like the start of a relationship. Delilah quickly becomes our Julia. She takes on the role of that crutch. She supports you first in the gameplay, and before long she draws out Henry's story, also while setting you tasks and moving on the plot. She's also flirtatious, and she seems like a support, and more than that, she could be the solution to Henry's brokenness that we want him to find. And over time, Henry talks less about Julia and more about her and the things that he does in the forest. And from a selfish point of view, we feel that we are helping Henry move on and continuing that sense of relief from not having to deal with the heaviness of Henry's backstory. And while I think we share a bond of wanting to avoid Henry's problems, I don't think full empathy has set in yet. But it does allow us as gamers to selfishly enjoy the new environment while being lured into a false sense that Henry is mending, and how the writers beautifully set us up for a fall. And sure, there are some hiccups along the way in the early stages. A strange man who shines a light in your eyes freaks you out, and more notably, an altercation with two teenagers who are setting off fireworks and having parties that only appear at a distance, who then seem to wage a campaign of violence against you by trashing your watchtower, cutting your communication lines before they go missing. But despite all this, for a while, everything feels like it's going to be okay. Your routine becomes stable, you go out and you find things and you learn about the forest, and it's this stage that mirrors somewhat the stability of that marriage between Julia and Henry. And all the way through, who's there for us? Delilah. The only voice we hear, our crutch, our rock, our hope. Or is she? The problem is that Delilah is not the fix we want her to be, and she never will be. She's a band-aid on a dementia-sized gaping wound. Soon we see that beyond all that charm and flirtation, she is as broken as Henry is, but we choose to ignore it. She drinks too much, she flirts with a heartbroken man in Henry, she accidentally or not allows him to overhear a conversation that makes him paranoid. And what is interesting the second time round is how many red flags there are in her character. She's dismissive of his concerns when he bumps into that stranger who shines a light in his eyes. She actively admits to lying to her sister about her ex cheating on her when he left her, rather than admit the truth that she'd been at fault. She lies to the police about those missing teenagers. She encourages our paranoia, and worst of all, she gives us hope. Through her flirtation and reassurance, she seems to promise to be a fix that Henry needs. She seems to be the solution that we need. And when it all comes crashing down at the end, it's what hurts most. But the thing is, it's not her fault. We as the gamer put pressure on her to be another Julia, another soulmate, an easy fix so that we too could avoid dealing with the problems, the real problems plaguing Henry. And we don't realise that until it's too late, that all the while we are in denial about how bad Henry truly is. And on top of that, we have inadvertently become her crutch because she needs support, and what we're actually dealing with is two exceptionally fragile and broken people. But in the first half of the game, while the going is good, the game puts us in a false sense of security, and it's only when we move into the latter half of the game that it takes an interesting turn. It all starts soon after a fire begins in the park. I think this fire is symbolic. The tranquil park we have called home is suddenly under threat. The early stages of the game are burning. It's representative of the way that Henry's stable life was suddenly under attack after Julia's diagnosis. Gone is the excitement and thrill and peace, replaced by anxiety and stress. It is a gentle transition, but when the fire first starts, it's like those initial stages of confusion when Henry wasn't sure what was wrong with Julia. And while the fire starts to burn, our life in the park really starts to go wrong. When we go fishing, we discover a strange clipboard on which are written transcripts of his conversations with Delilah, like somebody has been listening to them. It's strange, it's weird, and interestingly, written notes on a clipboard are kind of like the notes a doctor would have taken for Julia. And then as we find a radio on the ground, out of nowhere, somebody knocks us out. It's frightening, an unexpected plot twist, a knockout blow like the diagnosis was to Henry. Very quickly, our life in the national park starts to unravel, and for all our rationale as a gamer, we quickly get sucked into the idea that we are part of a bigger conspiracy. We have so many questions. Why do people like those teenagers go missing in the forest? What is the strange wire-fenced compound we discover? Why are there radio tags? Why are people listening to and writing down our conversations? The game does an incredible job of convincing us there's some kind of government conspiracy. Rather than allay your fears like a stable character would, Delilah only makes them worse. She reinforces Henry's paranoia, and in turn, our own. Because with a little bit of pressure to rock the stability, the cracks start to show in both of the characters. What is really interesting in this section is we can see how well the dialogue has been written. This is one of the genius parts of the writing that I noticed the second time round. While the dialogue choices don't have a massive impact on where the narrative leads or any moral choice, the options presented on screen, even if we don't choose them, put thoughts into your mind. Some of the options are just laced with paranoia, planting seeds to help you buy into Henry's delusion, and compounded by the fact that Delilah too is fueling this fantasy. I have never felt so much like I was being followed and stalked in a game before. This part of the game actually plays out more like a horror game at times. But the thing is, as we see the character of Henry crumble into madness, we're almost desperate for his conspiracy theory to be right because we're in denial. Because dealing with that is far easier than accepting the fact that we failed Henry, that all of his stability at the start was false and our attempts to fix him just didn't work. And I think it's now that the true empathy starts to creep in, because we both need a fantastical revelation, not only to avoid dealing with the heaviness of Julia's situation, but we as the gamer, we don't want to deal with that guilt that we helped Henry abandon Julia. And what's more, in the early stages, while all of his problems were just underneath the surface, we actually enjoyed the new experience of the forest, and we selfishly thought we'd fixed him. And all of that whirlwind of paranoia leads to a shocking revelation, but that revelation is a deflating one, far sadder than government conspiracies. The research outpost and tracking collars are just a science experiment, and the man who creeps you out with a flashlight at the start, he's not a secret agent chasing you, he's a man who suffers from PTSD after watching his son die. Just a broken man who gets scared you're going to find out the secret of his dead son, and he records your conversations to scare you. And much like Henry, he can't deal with his problems or the situation, so he runs away, or in the man's case he just gives up and lives in the national forest. The father's lack of capacity to deal with his son's death mirrors Henry's failure to deal with Julia, and in turn, our lack of capacity to deal with Henry. But the cruelest twist is still to come, because even at this stage, after the conspiracy comes crumbling down, there is still a little hope. Delilah, our crutch, when the forest and outposts are being evacuated because of the fire, she promises to be there waiting for us to get on the same helicopter. She promises, even though we force it, to be there for us, to be there for us. Similar to Julia's promise to be there for Henry while she married him. A promise that neither of them keep. She could still be the fix we need for Henry. And as he runs through the forest to get to her like an excited little boy, it's interesting that we basically have to traverse pretty much the entirety of the map. I think that journey is to build us up, and even the second time round when I knew what was going to happen, I was still hopeful. And when he makes it to the tower to find Delilah, her not being there is cruel. Rather than the happy ending we wanted or needed, the quick fix that means we can walk away from this game satisfied that we've helped Henry move on, her not being there just brings back the loneliness and isolation Henry felt at the end when Julia deteriorated, when she slipped away. That voice on the radio, like Julia's mind, had finally slipped away, and all that was left was nothing. But you do get one last chat with Delilah before she goes. She tells you that it's not the right time, and that he needs to see Julia. And the worst thing of all, she's right, and we know it. And it's in this moment that we realise that we are part of Henry's problem. We didn't fix him. More, we led a broken man through a story feeling like we had control, but instead realised somewhere along the line that we are passengers leading him to another failure. And our utter devastation, our lack of ability to fix him or change things in Henry's world, the sadness and the guilt, the deflation that we weren't part of something more, it leaves us feeling empty, but true empathy for Henry. Not just sympathy, that ending broke us, it left us broken, and now we truly understand Henry. And as the game closes, we're left wondering what will become of Henry. A level of his guilt is shared with us for allowing him to run from Julia, to be a little bit seduced, at least in the form of hope, by Delilah, a character that we deep down knew was as broken as he was. Delilah is not Julia, she more represents the cruel twists of life. I think that watchtower he finds himself in the forest is his loneliness and the isolation that he felt in his life, and the burning forest at the end is his world turning to ashes, and instead of a nice comfy resolution, we're just left thinking. And this is the message I think that the writers wanted us to feel. Considering the impact and cruel consequences of actions of people who just run away from problems, the fact that we only get a finite number of chances in this world, and that very rarely do easy fixes or special people come along. And that's the true power of this game, whether or not the events in the forest were meant to be a direct representation to reinforce Henry's story, or rather that it was just designed to make us feel more familiar to increase empathy. What matters is not that. What matters is that long after the closing of this game, I was left feeling raw from Delilah. I was left wondering whether Julia would ever come back. But of course she can't, and I was worrying about what would become of Henry, a man that I failed. I considered whether the events in the park were even real, or whether it was a representation of an intervention that Henry just couldn't process. Was Delilah even real? I mean, at one point she said she was as real as the sky was blue. At a moment when the sky was orange and purple. Was this all in Henry's head? Was Henry the one with dementia? Like he mentioned in a conversation, and the events there were just representative of his mind slipping away. I wondered why you never saw a single face in the game. Even the boy who died, his face was smashed in. I wondered why there were barely any animals in the forest, and with all that is why this game is special. Firewatch haunts your thoughts long after you put down the pad. It's undoubtedly one of the best told stories, leading to being one of the most thought-provoking experiences in a game that I have ever had. The point is, it made me think and feel so deeply, and we can all agree on that, whether or not you agree with my other conclusions. For me, in both stories, Henry goes from being a little bit out of depth, to finding a crutch, to being a bit more stable, to getting a period of unease before a big shock, a devastating moment before true loneliness creeps in. And what is that final feeling that the game leaves you with? Well, as the end of the game comes down, there is a little hope. Hope that Henry will finally confront his problems, the fact that he's reached out to Delilah, he reached out to someone, and that he will go and see Julia and move on. But then in this game, haven't we felt hope before? When we first met Julia, and then again when we started out in the forest for the first time. And that, my friends, is the problem with cycles. They just go round and round. And people, well, they just get stuck in loops sometimes. So all that leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching, and do let me know in the comments below whether or not you love Firewatch, and also any other indie experiences that you think that I should explore. But from me today, all it leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching, and this is Roy McCoy, out.